Every crime scene tells a story. Some tell us who did it, some tell us why, and then there are few rare cases that leave behind nothing but questions. Questions that survive for decades. Questions that outlive the investigators, the suspects, and sometimes even the crime scene itself. Tonight's story begins on an isolated farm in rural Germany, where 6 people were murdered. A killer vanished without a trace, and the most chilling clues appeared before the murders had even happened. This is the Deathlore, and welcome to episode 1 of Between the Lores, where the dead don't speak much, but sometimes they speak just enough to make us skip a heartbeat. Tonight, I'm walking you through one of the most unsettling and unsolved mysteries in criminal history. This is the story of Hinterkaifeck murders. Nestled among fields and forests, miles away from the nearest village, stood a lonely farm known as Hinterkaifeck. The property belonged to Andres Gruber and his wife Crazilia. Living with them was their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel and her 2 children, 7-year-old Crazilia Gabriel and 2-year-old Joseph Gabriel. Just days before the murders, a new maid named Maria had arrived to work at the farm. To an outsider, Hinterkaifeck looked ordinary. A farmhouse, a barn, livestock, fields stretching endlessly into the countryside. The kind of place where nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. But strange things had already begun. A few days before the murders, Andreas noticed footprints in the snow leading from a nearby forest towards the farmhouse. At first, he likely assumed they belonged to a hunter or a traveler. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual, though, was what came next. There were footprints leading to the farm, but none leading away from it. Someone had arrived, but no one appeared to have left. As unsettling as this was, it wasn't the only strange occurrence. At night, Andreas reportedly heard footsteps coming from the attic. He searched the attic himself, but found nothing. No intruder, no animal, no explanation. Only silence. And sometimes silence is far more frightening than finding someone hiding in the dark. Then, a set of keys disappeared. A newspaper appeared on the property, despite nobody in the family subscribing to it. Months earlier, the previous maid had abruptly quit her job, claiming the house was haunted. And honestly, at this point, many of us probably understand why she left that way. Any one of these incidents could have been dismissed. A misplaced key, an accidental newspaper delivery, strange noises in an old farmhouse, but only separately. They seemed harmless. Together, they painted a disturbing picture. A picture that investigators would understand after 6 people were dead. Looking back, each of these details feels weird. At that time, they were simply strange. No one knew they were counting down to a massacre. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, someone attacked the Gruber family. Investigators believe Andreas, his wife, Victoria, and young Crazilia were lured into the barn one by one. Perhaps a familiar noise. Perhaps a disturbance among the animals. Perhaps by something entirely different. Whatever drew them there, it worked. One after another, they entered the barn. And one after another, they were killed. The weapon was a mattock, a farming tool with a heavy metal head. The attacks were brutal, personal, and there was no sign of hesitation, no sign of mercy. But the most heartbreaking detail involved 7-year-old Crasilia. Investigators later discovered clumps of her hair tangled in her hands. Evidence suggested she survived for several hours after receiving her injuries. Imagine that. A child trapped in darkness, surrounded by the bodies of her family, in pain, terrified, and alone, long enough to understand something horrible had happened, long enough to suffer, long enough to be forgotten by the person who had done this. Inside the farmhouse, the nightmare continued. Maria, the new maid who had only recently arrived, was murdered in her bedroom. 2-year-old Joseph was killed while sleeping in his crib. By the end of the night, every person living at Hinterkaifeck was dead. But strangely enough, the murders themselves aren't what transformed this case into one of the world's most famous unsolved mysteries. It's what happened afterwards. Because the killer didn't appear to leave. Days passed. Neighbors noticed smoke rising from the chimney. Their livestock were fed. The cattle was cared for. Meals appeared to have been prepared. Someone was moving around the property. Someone was living there, among 6 dead bodies. As though nothing had happened. As though the farmhouse still belonged to them. And that's where the story becomes truly terrifying. Those strange events before the murders, the footprints, the attic noises, the missing keys, the newspaper. For years, people have wondered whether they were warnings, whether someone had been secretly watching the family, living on the property, studying their routines, learning their habits. Not the action of a ghost, but the action of a very patient killer. Then came April 4th. Concerned neighbors finally entered the property. What they found shocked the entire region. An entire family had been wiped out. 6 people murdered. And somehow, no one had seen the killer arrive. No one had seen the killer leave. The investigation quickly became one of Germany's largest criminal inquiries. More than 100 suspects were questioned. Countless theories emerged. Some believed robbery was the motive, but investigators struggled with that explanation. Money remained untouched. Valuables were left behind. Nothing suggested the killer had come for wealth. The murders felt personal. Very personal. One suspect attracted more attention than any other. A local man named Lawrence. He had a complicated history with Victoria Gabriel and her family. Some believed he had a motive. Some believed he had opportunity. Others argued that suspicion alone isn't evidence. Over the years, this name became permanently attached to this case. Yet, despite decades of discussions, investigators never found enough evidence to charge him. And so, the mystery remained, officially unsolved. Over a century later, the question still lingers. Who left the footprints on the snow? Who was moving around the attic? Why did the killer remain on the farm after committing such a gruesome murder? And perhaps the most disturbing question of all. Were the strange events before the killings simply coincidences? Or proof that someone had already been living in the shadows of Hinterkaifeck long before March 31st? We'll probably never know. The farm itself was eventually demolished. The buildings are gone. The barn is gone. The house is gone. Only the land remains. But some mysteries don't disappear when the structures around them do. They linger, waiting much like the questions left behind at Hinterkaifeck. If you would like to see real photographs connected to this case, including images of actual Hinterkaifeck farm and the people involved, head over to our Instagram and YouTube pages. Sometimes reading about a crime is disturbing. Seeing the place where it actually happened is something else entirely. And before we disappear into the darkness tonight, next Thursday, Deathlore travels from an isolated German farmhouse to a quiet apartment in Noida. A case that divided an entire nation. A crime scene that raised more questions than answers. A murder investigation so controversial that people are still debating it years later. The death of Arushi Talwar. Lock your doors, keep the lights on, because some mysteries don't stay buried. They wait until someone starts asking questions again. This has been the Deathlore. Stay alive and safe until we meet again to uncover the next lore. Good night.